authorities on specific subjects. I am Munajit Majumdar, editor for explanatory journalism at the Indian Express. Today, we are discussing Russia and the war in Ukraine, obviously. It's a story that's been running since February 24th, and in these 7 months, it has dominated news cycles everywhere and perhaps left no country anywhere in the world untouched by it. Indeed, some of you who have attended this event before would recall that today is the third time that this issue is being discussed on this forum. For today's discussion, we are honored to have with us here D.B.Venkatesh Varma, the former Indian ambassador to Russia, a diplomat who was posted to Moscow thrice over more than 3 decades of a very distinguished career, and an expert who has been closely involved with the evolution of India's relations with Russia. Ambassador Varma, thank you for your time. We are very grateful to you.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Speaking to Ambassador Varma will be my colleague, Shubhajit Roy. Shubho has been tracking the Russia story very closely, as those of you who have been reading him in the Indian Express know. And he has written a very important article on it only today. It's currently on our website, www.indianexpress.com, and it will appear in our print edition tomorrow. Today's event is brought to you by our partner, Yojana IAS. My thanks to our partner. And thank you all for joining, and welcome once again. Shubho.
Thank you. Thank you, Munajit. It's indeed a privilege to host Mr. D.B.Venkatesh Varma, who I've had the privilege of knowing for the last decade and a half. And he retired as the Indian ambassador to Russia. And but as Munajit pointed out, he has had a very illustrious career over spanning 3 decades. He started his career from Russia in Moscow back in 1990, and in fact ended his career in Russia in October 2021. It's fair to say today that I think outside the Indian establishment, if there is one person who understands contemporary Russia best, it's Ambassador Varma. Thank you, Ambassador Varma, for joining us for this conversation at the Indian Express.
A great pleasure. Thank you.
Ambassador Varma, you've, if I may start with this discussion, framing from the point of view of your career. I was struck by your 3 postings that you had thrice in the last 3 decades that you served in Russia. The first time you went was in 1990, and 1990 to 1992 you were there. Then you went in 2000 and stayed there from 2000 to 2003, and your last posting was from 2018 to 2021. Now, each of these periods have been pivotal points in Russia's history, contemporary history. And so I would really start the conversation today, especially in a week where after 7 months of war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it has again sort of grabbed the headlines with President Putin ordering partial mobilization of his troops, of reservists in his country. Last week, we saw Prime Minister Modi having his first in-person meeting with the Russian president and reminding him in public that today this is not the era of war. And we see now, the world leaders have picked onto this comment by Prime Minister Modi and have delivered messages at the UN as well. Prominent being French President Emmanuel Macron. So at a time like this, I want to just rewind and step back a bit and ask you, Venkatesh Varma, you went to Russia in 1990. It was the country Russia was Soviet Union back then. It was the erstwhile Soviet Union was in a state of ferment, and you saw it up close when the collapse of erstwhile Soviet Union took place. You were there, and you were there when the August coup in 1991 happened. So the failed attempt that happened. So take us to that time. What did you see back then? Just to give us a context of the Russia that we are talking about today.
Well, first of all, thank you for the introduction and for having me on this program, to Mr. Majumdar and to you, Subhajit. I was in Russia thrice, as you stated. The first time I went to the Soviet Union, during its last days, I was there during the breakup of the Soviet Union. And thereafter, I went again when President Putin became president for the first time in the year 2000. And the last time that I was there, the third time I was there, it was between 2018 and 2021, which is representing our country as India's ambassador. Well, Russia has changed a lot during these 30 years. So has the world, and changes in Russia, of course, also impact the world. And I think that's something that we ought to not to forget. Russia has changed fundamentally because it has opened up to the world. It has become democratic. It's no longer a communist party ruling that country. Russia has also produced a very open-minded middle class, integrated and part of globalization. Russia became a member of the WTO. But over a period of time, you realize that in Russia, some changes which are quite revolutionary happen in 20 years, and Russia remains unchanged in 200 years. So there are certain things about Russia that don't change. And I think the key factor about Russia, relating to Russia, is geopolitics. I think geopolitics was dominant towards most of the post-Cold War period. But geopolitics moved in a direction where Russia found it more and more restrictive, especially with respect to Ukraine. And I think the current crisis that is unfolding, and we are still in deep inside the crisis, is related to Russia's geopolitical problems and how these problems have been addressed over a period of time. Unfortunately, we are in a phase where these are being addressed through the use of military force. But the underlying causes were always there. And inadequate diplomacy, inadequate accommodation amongst the big powers is something that that is playing out now.
Yeah, Ambassador Varma, 1990 to 92 you were there, and 2000 you go there when Putin becomes the president. What were the changes you saw from the time when you left the country last, when Gorbachev had stepped down, Boris Yeltsin had become the country's leader, and Putin, the transition to Putin, and just to give context, Boris Yeltsin, when he resigned on 31st of December 1999, he almost went unnoticed in India, because India was on that day was sort of relieved to have hostages from the Kandahar hijack back in India. And the Y2K phenomenon was really bothering the minds of the world. And Putin, who was seen as a security chief of the country and the establishment, was handpicked by Boris Yeltsin. What was the sense that you got when you reached there in 2000 and 2003, the early years of Putin era?
Well, the first term and the early years of Putin were actually, in retrospect, the golden age of democratic Russia. The 1990s were a period of great trauma for the Russian people. Russian GDP fell almost 60%. Industrial production plummeted. Russia was in deep debt. It had problems of secession and extremism and terrorism in Chechnya. Russian demography was badly hit. Russia lost as many people in the decade of the 1990s as the fall in the birth rate during the 1940s when it fought the Second World War. So the turnaround that President Putin brought around was to consolidate Russia politically, to suppress the terrorism and secessionist elements, particularly with respect to Chechnya, and modernize the Russian economy, helped, of course, by the fact that that period also coincided with high oil prices. So Russia paid off its debt largely. Russia was able to consolidate its financial position. And Russia made efforts to integrate with the outside world. So we often don't notice that India and Russia opened up to globalization approximately at the same time. But Russia's actual effectiveness in engaging with globalization occurred only in the years of the 2000s. Russia-United States relations were in particularly good shape. President Putin was the first leader to call President Bush to convey his condolences and his support after the 9/11 attack. On terrorism, Russia extended support for United States forces in Afghanistan and the fight against the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda. With respect to non-proliferation, with respect to arms control, with respect to the JCPOA with Iran later. So there was a strong tradition of cooperation with the United States. Similarly, there was a strong tradition of cooperation with the EU. The EU became the largest trading partner for Russia. There was a dramatic change in the Russian automobile industry, like there was a change in India. We just started the Maruti initially, but then we got a number of other foreign automobile partners who came into India. They also went into Russia. That changed the industry. The civil industry was changed. And Russia engaged very actively at the United Nations. But Russia was also active with respect to its Eastern policy. It kept up its relations with India continuously during this period. And of course, from the year 2000 onwards, Russia-China relations also improved. So I would say the first decade of President Putin's tenure as president was actually, again, in retrospect, a time when Russia was stabilized, its economy improved, and the social and economic conditions of the population saw a particularly marked improvement.
Right. I was listening to this podcast, and where they played George W. Bush's first conversation with after press conference after he met Putin in his ranch, and he says that he got a sense of the person, something to the effect that he could see his soul, and he could trust President Putin. Otherwise, he wouldn't have invited him to his ranch. So the relationship between the US president and the Russian president was reflective of a newfound warmth after decades of Cold War, decades of tension, stress between relationships between two blocs. And what changed? Where did it sort of started diminishing? At what point did that particular newfound bonhomie sort of dissipate?
Well, of course, there are two different narratives on what went wrong. the Western narrative, the American narrative, is that Russia took a turn towards authoritarianism in the towards 2008, 2009. Number one. Number two, it became more restrictive of democratic rights, and it also started asserting its policies in its near neighborhood. The Russian narrative is different. They said that they reached out to the United States in several areas, but the United States was not willing to accept Russia as an equal partner. The first break in their relations, in a sense, came about in the Russian approach to the United States invasion of Iraq. That is the first difference that came about. And slowly it multiplied. The Russians were also very concerned about the impulse of unilateralism in US policy, particularly with respect to existing arms control agreements. For example, in 2003, the ABM treaty was abrogated. They had difficulties with the Conventional Forces in Europe treaty. And slowly the issues started building up. Of course, the biggest bone of contention between Russia, the Europeans, and the United States was the issue of NATO expansion. There were different expectations on both sides. The Russians felt that there were certain commitments that were given towards the end of the Cold War. The United States and NATO felt that it was the right of sovereign right of countries which had been newly liberated in Eastern Europe from the Warsaw Pact to choose their own security choices, to make their own security choices, and therefore NATO expansion came about. There were 5 waves of NATO expansion. Russia objected at each stage, but over a period of time, Russia was weak at every stage, but over a period of time, Russia gained the strength that it could actually oppose NATO expansion, and that came to a head with respect to the problem of Ukraine wanting to turn completely towards the West, towards the EU and NATO, and that change came about in 2014. So the period between 2014 and 2021 can be the period when Russia and Ukraine tried to find a modus vivendi, given the fact, through the Minsk agreements, given the fact that Ukraine had very clearly shown its foreign policy choices not to balance relations with Russia and with the EU and NATO, but turn completely exclusively in favor of the West. This, of course, created a civil war type situation in Donbass, which continued over a period of time, which got militarized. There were also measures taken by the Kyiv government against Russian language and television and Russian speaking opposition parties. So the whole thing came to a head, of course, at the beginning of this year, late last year, 2021, and the beginning of this year, when, of course, Russia decided to intervene militarily and actually conducted a military intervention and invasion of Ukraine. So this has been a steady decline in confidence, in trust, in areas of cooperation. It is, I think, an indication that the accommodation of interests between the great powers, between the big powers, that ethic slowly was eroded, and the United States and NATO pushed Russia, and Russia responded when it was able to respond. It was not able to respond 5 times during the 5 waves of, and I think this entire process is being played out currently as we speak with respect to Ukraine.
Right. So, you touched upon the NATO expansion, and, 2014 was a kind of a point where annexation of Crimea and the sort of how Europe actually looked the other way, and in some ways. And so you reached there in 2018 as the ambassador. This is your 3rd time you're there. And by then, Russian President Putin has sort of consolidated his power to a great extent. You see the much more stronger Putin than you saw him last time. And I want to understand from you on President Putin's decision-making apparatus. If you could explain to us, we've seen reports of how it's a very closed, opaque system. There are oligarchs who control a lot of information. They are influential in the system. The military is very powerful, but the Russian president actually sort of is the all-powerful president, leader in the Russian system. We've seen videos, of Russian intelligence chiefs being berated in public by the Russian president in the last few months. So that gives a sense of a much more assertive, some might call authoritarian leadership by Russian President Putin. If you could explain to us what was the decision-making system that you saw there?
Well, of course, Russia is an executive presidency by its own constitution. And President Putin has been in power since 2000. Of course, in between, President Medvedev was also president. But President Putin has essentially been either president or prime minister since the year 2000. There have been regular democratic elections. And by and large, democratic elections have turned out to extend support to President Putin or his political program. And the political program itself has changed over a period of time. The first decade was one of economic and political consolidation, of engagement with the outside world. And the second decade has become more restrictive. Those changes you could see. But essentially, the democratic structure as constituted by the Constitution of Russia is still holding. There are regular elections at the national level, at the regional level. There are multi-candidate elections. So it is, the Western press tends to say that Russia is authoritarian in the same way as China is authoritarian. There are big differences between the two. China is a single-party country. The Communist Party has a monopoly over power. Democratic elections are not held in the way that we understand them as how democracy functions in the rest of the world. The Russian Federation is also a very complex federation. It's a very large country with a very large regional diversity. And there are governors who are young, who are from the region, who are sometimes technocrats, sometimes are, as you popularly call them, oligarchs. But the true meaning of oligarchs, which is those who have tremendous amount of wealth, who use wealth for political purposes, actually saw its peak in the 1990s. President Putin has, in fact, very clearly said that those who wish to make money in business are most welcome to do so, but they should keep out of politics. And I think that division has largely worked. Of course, the second point that is made is the strong influence of the security forces. Of course, President Putin himself comes from a security background. But these background indications, I think, are over-exaggerated in a way. President Putin, I think, conducts the affairs of state and affairs of government in a manner that is fairly open for discussion. Of course, the decisions that he takes are his decisions, and these are implemented. There is a sense that democratic restrictions are, the Russian government and the security forces are less tolerant today than they've been, say, about 10 years ago. I think probably that is true. But largely, I think President Putin's popularity, public popularity, has always stayed pretty high. It has been above 60% through many years, and presently it is over 75-80% because of the war, in Ukraine. There is a multiplicity of media. The television is more inclined to be with the government, but there are newspapers. Some of them have been shut down most recently, but for the last 20 years, there have been newspapers. There's a very vibrant Twitter social media community, on Telegram, on Facebook, on Twitter. Russia has not banned any of these, unlike China, where many of these don't work. So I think this tendency to equate Russia and China both as authoritarian in the same thing, I think is a lazy generalization that we tend to accept, which is very popular in the Western press, but I think it doesn't correspond to reality. President Putin has also nurtured a new economic leadership, a new generation. We see the Russian government, many of their ministers in the main ministries are 40, 45, 50-year-old, extremely qualified professional ministers. So you have a combination of powerful representatives of the security services, but you also have a new modern outward-looking technocratic and economic elite. So Russia is a far more complex and more evolved political system than is normally understood by the outside world.
Right. So what you're describing to me looks like there is a scope for opposition, there's a scope for dissent within the society, in the political system. Is that correct reading? Is that a fair?
Of course. You see, opposition is expressed in very many ways. The Communist Party of Russia, which is the successor of the old Soviet Communist Party, has gone through various phases. It used to be the biggest opposition party once upon a time. In the last Duma elections, it got only 8% of the vote. In the latest Duma elections, which happened a year ago, they got 18% of the vote. And they are not supporters of the Russia United Party, which is the ruling party. Of course, during a period of war, I mean, if you are asking if there's opposition to the policies of the government with respect to what is happening today, of course, we are, I think, now in a different situation. And with democratic restrictions are far more narrowly defined than they have been in the past. But I would say that Russia is not unique, because if you are in a warlike situation, you tend to have certain restrictions on political discourse, and that is being seen in Russia today.
Right. So you were in Russia. I mean, you retired from Russia Indian ambassadorship from there in last year October. So it's been like 11 months now. And so I wanted to just, in hindsight, when you read the signals back then, did you get a sense at that time that there was a impending military operation by the Russian army, Russian military, Russian establishment on Ukraine? Did you get that sense back then?
You see, Russia's concerns on Ukraine are more than a decade old. The proposal for Ukraine's membership of NATO began in 2002, 2003. Russia expressed its concerns. President Putin made a very important speech in 2007 in the Munich conference, where Russia very clearly said that Ukraine's membership of NATO would be a red line for Russia. The 2014 events, the so-called Maidan events in Kyiv, I think were a turning point. A point of no return was reached, where Russia took over Crimea. There were Russian-assisted forces in the Donbass. But in 2015, there was an effort at accommodation through the Minsk agreements. And the Minsk agreements were important because Russia was prepared to deal with Ukraine as an independent, sovereign country with its territories, with its territorial integrity intact. But what they supported, what they pushed for, was that the Donbas region, which is Donetsk and Luhansk, which is almost 80-90% Russian speakers, be given provincial autonomy through a constitutional amendment in Kyiv by the Ukrainian parliament. This was mediated by France and Germany. And there were several rounds of discussions with Ukraine, with France and Germany, as what is called the Normandy format. But over a period of time, Russia got the sense that neither Ukraine was willing to compromise and implement the Minsk agreements, nor were the French and the Germans willing or perhaps even able to convince the Ukrainians to go ahead and implement the Minsk II agreements. So if you're asking me whether this war is inevitable, I would say it was not inevitable. There was a certain period of time, a window of time, when mutual compromise was possible, I would say until 2018, 2019. But by the year 2020, I think Russia realized that both United States and European support for Ukrainian military, which has started in 2016, was reaching a stage where the Ukrainian military would become extremely strong, including the naval, air, and the land forces. And there was no progress on the Minsk agreements on giving autonomy. And the Ukraine also indicated a number of measures which were restrictive for rights of Russian speakers in the Donbas area. This entire belt is of Russian origin thing. I think by 2021, Russia realized that the Minsk agreement had no future. France and Germany were unwilling or unable to play a positive role. And it was only through the United States that a last-ditch effort could be made to find a modus vivendi between Russia and Ukraine. Now, President Putin's meeting with President Biden in 2021 in Geneva was I think the last-ditch effort to see whether something can be worked out. It was clear during the year 2021 that Russia had mobilized and undertaken very major exercises in Voronezh, in the areas surrounding Ukraine. This was a signal that Russia was pretty serious about this matter. But I think these lost opportunities led to December of 2021, when it became clear, and this was after I left, when it became clear that Russia this time was not going to back off. Whether it was a calculation, a well-placed calculation, or a misplaced calculation, we can, there are different views on that. But the war that started in February 24th was, I think, after Russia had come to the conclusion that it was no longer possible to defend its interests in Ukraine in the direction in which Ukraine was heading with respect to its engagement with prominent NATO countries.
Thank you for this very important context playing background that you gave to us to understand, how the situation developed to 24th of February and the invasion of Ukraine took place. India obviously has made several statements since then. But before I move to the Indian position, I want to understand from you, you watched the conflict closely from here. It's been exactly 7 months today that the conflict began. Where do you think the conflict is right now, and where is it headed? I mean, we have seen reports how southeast and eastern part of Ukraine is in Russian control. There is fighting going on. Putin has started a process of referendum in these areas, in these provinces. So if you could give us a sense of the conflict.
Yeah, You're right. So, Vijit, we are in the 7th month of the conflict. It started in February. It is a military conflict between Russia and Ukraine, a military war, but it is also a conflict uh, between Russia and the West. We are now in the 4th phase of the conflict. I presume that the 4th phase has just started. The first phase was the first 8 to 10 weeks where Russia intervened militarily both in the north, east, and the south of Ukraine, and finally pulled out from Kyiv, Sumy, and Kharkiv, around Kharkiv, and reinforced its forces with respect to the eastern and southern part of Ukraine. In the second phase, so the first phase was largely a stalemate. Russia made advances in the south and the east, but in the north, its military advances were stopped and in fact rolled back. The second phase saw far greater Russian military advances. They took Mariupol, they defeated the Azov battalion, and they made considerable headway in the Luhansk area. By the end of the second phase, which is around July, early August, we had seen that Russian forces, along with the local forces, had completed the occupation of the Luhansk district. They had also occupied almost half of Donetsk district. The third phase was between, say, August and late September, when we saw a very major counterattack, a very successful counterattack by the Ukrainian armed forces, which led to almost Ukrainian armed forces occupying areas around Kharkiv, reoccupying their own territory around Kharkiv, almost up to the Russian border. The fourth phase, of course, now begins with President Putin's announcement recently that there would be a mobilization of forces, almost up to 300,000, and they would hold referenda in Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia. All these four, of course, are Russian majority speakers. They are between 75 to 90% or 95% are Russian speakers. The end of the third phase saw that Russia was too weak to win, and Ukraine was too strong to lose. Now, this stalemate could have continued because neither side was prepared either to talk through peaceful negotiations or to have a decisive military victory on the battlefield. But now that Russia has mobilized, and this is a very major step, in fact, it is an escalation, I would say, where over 300,000 troops are being. Now, Ukraine's military capabilities have evolved over a period of time. In the beginning, the first phase of the war, second phase of the war, Ukrainians fought almost with their own weapons. Part of them were old Soviet weapons, but also some of the weapons that had been supplied by NATO in the past. But in the third phase, and now, Ukraine is almost entirely equipped with new NATO equipment, very high quality, high precision, high effectiveness equipment. But the fact is that many of the Ukrainian armed forces, their numbers have been depleted. So Ukraine has a paradoxical problem today. It has probably an unlimited supply of extremely advanced weapons from the West, from NATO and the United States. But its ability to draw on more and more trained personnel, I think, is being restricted because of the long war that has been going on for 7 months. Russia now had a shortage of equipment. I think Russia is going to pick up more from its own reserves. But Russia had a specific shortage of manpower, and this was an infantry intensive conflict, because if you take territory and you want to hold territory, you need infantry, and Russia was definitely short of infantry. But the infusion, now that more than 300,000 troops will now be mobilized, and it's not that all 300,000 troops will be deployed in Ukraine, but the mobilization that is taking place will help offset Russian deployments from active military forces to Ukraine, whose place will then be taken by these new troops that are coming through the mobilization process. So we are now getting into a phase where both sides still believe that they can decide the matter through military means. That is an expectation that they can do. But there is also the expectation that finally, when the military means get exhausted or military aims get exhausted, some peace-based settlement will be possible. There was, as you recall, in late March, an attempt at some peace mediation. And President Putin very recently, in fact, he told our Prime Minister in Samarkand that Russia was prepared to have peace dialogue with Ukraine, but it was the Ukrainian side that was unwilling to go forward and sit down for negotiations. Ukraine is now fighting as part of a coalition. So I don't think Ukrainian war aims are limited to just what Ukraine wants. They are in close touch with several NATO allies and the United States. So there has to be a change in the approach of both the United States, key NATO countries, and Ukraine for a modus vivendi to appear on this. But however, the issue of referenda and incorporation of territory into Russia will pose a very substantial legal problem, international law problem, and a problem of territorial integrity. And we don't know how this circle will be squared in the months ahead.
Thank you for explaining the conflict in such vivid detail in 3 waves and how the 4th wave is now underway. Apart from the partial mobilization